I realized I was holding someone else's death when I saw how much money was there and that my ex-fiancé had vanished without a trace. It wasn't even about the money, you know? It was about how fast something you thought was buried in the past could return and just ruin your present. I'm talking about Jason Hayes. I'm 30, an interior designer living in Los Angeles. I have a normal, quiet life that I built after Jason just walked out 3 years ago. He left not because he stopped loving me, but because a chance came up, the daughter of some producer. Money, connections, a career boost. Classic stuff. He abandoned me, our whole life together, and never looked back. I got over it back then, locked away all those feelings, and moved on. I thought that person would remain in the past forever, just a painful memory. Last week started like any other. I got home late after a long day at the studio, dreaming only of slipping off my shoes and decompressing. But just as I was closing the door, the bell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. In L.A., if someone shows up unannounced, it's almost always a bad sign. I looked through the peephole, and my heart seized up so hard I could barely breathe. Jason was standing on my doorstep. He was holding a huge bouquet of red roses, so ridiculously big they almost covered his face. He looked older than I remembered, tired, and his usual smug, self-satisfied smile looked somehow strained. But there he was, on my doorstep, after all these years. I felt that old, cold anger rising inside me. I opened the door and immediately demanded to know what he wanted. My voice was ice cold, but he ignored it, literally squeezing himself into my entryway. The cloying, heavy scent of the roses instantly filled the air. He started rambling some nonsense about how amazing I looked, but I cut him off, reminding him why we weren't together. I told him straight up that he chose another woman and another life, and he shouldn't stand here pretending it was some kind of hard decision. That's when his practiced charm evaporated. Jason started complaining that his parents pressured him, that it was the only way forward, otherwise they would have disowned him, that his mother was sick back then, and he had no choice. I didn't buy it. His parents were always snobs, but that didn't force him to lie to me and humiliate me. I demanded he leave. He was already turning toward the door when he seemed to remember something and stopped abruptly. From behind his back, he produced a sleek black leather briefcase. It looked expensive, very solid, and felt surprisingly heavy when I eventually picked it up. "I need a favor, Olivia," he said quietly, and that quietness was worse than shouting. "I need you to hold on to this case. Just for a couple of days. They're work documents. Very important. I can't carry it around the city, I have too many meetings. Please, I can't trust anyone else with this." I wanted to refuse, wanted to yell at him to get the hell out with his documents and his problems. I didn't want a single trace of him left in my apartment. But there was something in his eyes, in his tone, that made me hesitate. He looked cornered. Not like a swindler, but like a victim. And that single second, that stupid, idiotic moment of pity, cost me everything. I nodded. I said I'd hold it, but I wouldn't be responsible for it. He set the case down by the wall, thanked me, and that's when I noticed he didn't look like the Jason I knew. He looked like someone running away. He said, "Goodbye," but it sounded more like, "Don't wait for me." And he was gone. The next day, he didn't call. The day after that, still nothing. I tried calling him myself, just to know when to get rid of this damn case, but his phone was off. I texted him, but the message remained unread. That's when something clicked in my head. His disappearance wasn't like his previous antics. Before, he'd disappear with an arrogant smirk. Now, it was with the look of a man who didn't want to be found. I felt a wave of panic rising. This was something more than just documents. The case stood in the corner, a silent, heavy witness to something awful, something that had just forced its way into my life. I could feel its presence even when I turned away. By the end of the week, when Jason still hadn't shown up or made contact, I knew he wasn't coming back. And I needed to know what I was storing. I couldn't live with this heavy black box, full of the unknown, which seemed to be attracting trouble. I decided to open it. I found my old rotary tool in the storage cabinet. My hands were shaking. When I turned it on, it roared, and sparks flew across the room as the blade chewed into the metal latches. The acrid smell of burnt metal filled the air. I worked for a long time, trying not to think about what I was doing, until the last lock finally gave way with a sharp clack. In the sudden silence, my pulse hammered in my ears. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there were no documents. No papers. The case was filled to the brim. Neatly stacked, secured with bank straps, were bundles of US dollars. Money. A lot of money. More than I had ever seen in my life, more than I could ever earn. From wall to wall, tightly packed, without a single gap. Cash. I recoiled, pressing my hands to my face. This wasn't just documents. This was someone's death. It explained everything: Jason's hunted look, his desperate plea, his sudden and absolute vanishing. I realized that what was sitting in my apartment, in quiet West Hollywood, wasn't just someone's inheritance, but something stolen, something people lose more than just a career over, they lose their lives. And I, the fool, had become the custodian of this time bomb. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do now. This was only the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on the floor in front of that open case, and it felt like it wasn't money but some kind of snake curled up inside my quiet, safe home. My vision blurred, all I could see was that green mass of banknotes, and one thought circled in my head: this is a curse, and Jason, in his final and cruelest act of betrayal, had passed that curse on to me. I couldn't breathe in the smell of expensive leather and paper that came from the case. It felt like the smell of someone else's crime. The first thing I did was slam the lid shut. The loud snap was as sharp as a gunshot. I tried to lift it, but it was too heavy, as if filled with rocks instead of bills. I dragged it into the bedroom, shoved it into the farthest corner of the closet, and piled winter coats and boxes of documents on top. It was pointless, I knew, but I needed to hide it from my own eyes, so I wouldn't constantly see that symbol of someone else's catastrophe. But even buried under clothing, it seemed to emit its invisible, sticky aura into the darkness. For the next 2 days, I didn't leave the house except for work. My head was heavy, like that black case. I couldn't focus on a single design project because my brain was frantically running through options. Call the police? What would I tell them? My ex-fiancé, who dumped me for a rich bride, brought me a suitcase full of cash and then disappeared. They'd immediately suspect me of being an accomplice. They'd ask why I waited a whole week before reporting it, why I opened it myself. I would end up under investigation, and even if I was found innocent, my name would be ruined. And if this money belongs to really powerful people, like Jason's mother used to talk about, the police probably wouldn't be able to protect me. Hide it and forget it? I imagined paying off the mortgage, buying the studio I'd always dreamed of. But that fantasy immediately shattered against reality. Money of this volume doesn't disappear without a trace. Someone will come looking for it. And if Jason was killed because of this, then I, as the last person he contacted, am the next target. I felt the noose tightening. On the second day after the discovery, I realized I had no time to waste. I needed to understand who he was running from. I couldn't go to his friends or parents. It was too dangerous. I started searching for information about Jason Hayes online, but I did it not from my work computer, but from a library, where everything is anonymous, trying not to leave any digital tracks. I scoured the news, financial reports, even the gossip sites that used to follow his social life with that producer's daughter, Sophia. After a couple of hours of searching, I found a short note on some little-known entertainment site. The note was old, about a month old, but it was there: son of famous film mogul Hayes, Jason Hayes, mysteriously vanished amidst major financial fraud investigation. No details. Just vanished. But the real shock was waiting for me on Sophia's page. She hadn't just broken off the engagement, she had married some European investor and left the country. The article showed a photo of their luxurious villa. That didn't surprise me. Sophia always knew when to escape. But in the comments, I found what I was looking for, the thing that sobered me completely. Someone, signed The Knowledgeable, wrote that Jason hadn't vanished but had been taken out for reaching into the pockets of those who don't know the word forgive. It was explicitly stated that he was dealing with Russian money that was part of some international scheme and that he tried to steal a little for himself. Those words, taken out, Russian money, hit me like a physical blow. Now everything was crystal clear. This wasn't just some unpaid debt. This was high-level crime, and the case in my closet was that very stolen little bit. Jason hadn't handed me work documents. He had used me as the safest, most unobvious storage unit. It was vile, but also brilliant. Who would look for stolen fortunes with the unsuspecting ex-fiancé he had abandoned? I returned home feeling as if a target was painted on my back. Every passing car seemed like surveillance, every telephone ring a warning signal. I walked into my apartment, and the first thing I noticed was the closet where the case lay hidden. It had become the center of my universe, a magnet drawing danger. I started living in a state of constant anxiety. I checked the lock on the door multiple times, scrutinizing the dark windows of neighboring buildings. I started avoiding crowded places where I might be noticed. I even stopped using my credit card in unfamiliar spots, afraid my trail would be calculated. My whole quiet, orderly life, which I had worked so hard to rebuild after Jason, crumbled in a few days. I wanted to just drag the case out, take it to the nearest cliff, and toss it into the ocean, to get rid of it forever, even at the cost of all that enormous money. But I couldn't. The fear of those who might be looking for it was stronger. They might already be watching me, just waiting for me to make a mistake and lead them to the money. If I got rid of the case, they might decide I took it for myself, and then it would be over. My only option, it seemed, was to sit quietly, not move, and wait. Wait until the statute of limitations expired or until these people decided the money was lost. But waiting under this kind of stress was unbearable. I felt my calm dissolving, replaced by cold, hard paranoia. Jason, even dead, had managed to completely ruin my life. And so, on one of those evenings, as I sat in the darkness, listening to every rustle outside, I realized that this fear was not only destroying me but changing me. I became sharper, more distrustful. I became like a person who is always anticipating a blow. I began to understand that to survive, I would have to become as cunning as Jason, who, however unsuccessfully, thought he could outsmart these people. I had to keep everything under control. The night was cold, and even under the covers, I shivered. And the case in the closet no longer seemed like just an object, but a part of me, my dark, unchosen destiny. That feeling of hopelessness and solitude was the heaviest burden. I spent the next few days thinking about this. I couldn't go to the police. I couldn't tell my friends. I was completely alone in this city with a deadly secret. My work suffered. I started canceling meetings, inventing phony excuses. How could I design a beautiful kitchen for someone when stacks of dollars that got a man killed were sitting in my closet? It was absurd and terrifying. On Thursday, about a week after I opened the case, I felt like I was going crazy from the isolation. I needed someone to pull me back to reality, someone who had no connection to Jason or his dirty dealings. I decided that I needed to meet an old acquaintance who moved in those circles, to casually ask a few questions. I needed to understand how far these people's tentacles reached and how truly dangerous they were, just to assess my risk. I chose a spot downtown, where there are always a lot of people. I felt like I was doing something very stupid, but without information, would simply go mad. This was the first step I took, not out of fear, but out of necessity to act. I put on inconspicuous clothes, left my phone at home, took only cash, and set off. That day, I clearly felt for the first time that my life no longer belonged to me. It belonged to that case and to those who would come for it. The decision to actively seek information was the stupidest, yet most necessary, thing I've ever done. I felt like a character in a bad movie, but the alternative was rotting in my apartment with that briefcase, waiting for the inevitable knock. I drove downtown, avoiding my usual routes, leaving my phone behind because of the fear that whoever was looking for the case might be able to trace my movements. The anonymity of the city was supposed to be my shield, but the paranoia was a heavy cloak, suffocating me. I met an old acquaintance, a guy named Mark who used to work in the same vague circle as Jason's rich crowd. We met in a crowded, noisy bar near the financial district, the kind of place where money is exchanged along with drinks. I kept the conversation light, asking about Jason's disappearance as if I were only worried about an old friend. Mark was a nervous type, always looking over his shoulder, but he did confirm what I already suspected. He mumbled something about Jason being involved with people who didn't lend money, they only invested in control, and that when the control was lost, they didn't send lawyers. They sent cleaners. He didn't mention names, just said that Jason had been arrogant, thinking he could double-cross them, and that his disappearance was no accident. The details were vague, but the message was crystal clear. The money in my closet was radioactive, and the people looking for it operated outside the law, outside everything I understood. Mark cut the conversation short, telling me to forget I ever knew Jason and to never, ever ask these questions again. I left the bar feeling worse than when I walked in. I had hoped for a lifeline, but all I got was confirmation that I was holding a death sentence. The adrenaline wore off, replaced by crushing despair. I walked quickly through the busy street, my head down, desperate to get back to my car and hide again. That's when the first real thing happened, the kind of event that breaks your isolation. I was fumbling with my keys, trying to unlock the car door, when a blur of movement hit me from the side. Someone, a kid, maybe, or just a quick desperate junkie, slammed into me, snatching my small purse. It only held $20 and my keys, but the shock was absolute. Before I could even yell, a voice shouted, sharp and authoritative, and a tall figure was sprinting past me in pursuit. It was so fast, so sudden, that I just stood there, frozen, staring at the empty space where the thief had been only seconds before. The man who chased him down was back quickly. He wasn't breathing heavily, which was the first thing I noticed. He had a natural, easy confidence about him. He was tall, maybe late 30s, wearing a simple leather jacket and dark jeans, but everything about him seemed controlled. He wasn't frantic or excited, he was simply efficient. He held my purse out to me. "You need to hold on to this tighter," he said, and his smile was genuinely warm, the kind that reaches his eyes. This city doesn't wait for permission to take what it wants. I was still shaking, completely thrown by the attack. I took the purse back, mumbling thanks. I felt foolish, weak, and exposed. I don't even know how to thank you," I finally managed to say. He shrugged easily. "How about you let me buy you a cup of coffee? You look like you could use one. It's the least I can do for having crashed your evening." Every alarm bell that should have been ringing in my paranoid, Jason-scarred brain was silent. After the isolation, after the constant fear and the heavy confirmation from Mark, I just wanted a moment of normal human connection. I wanted to feel safe, even for 10 minutes, next to someone who wasn't staring at the back of my head. I looked at him, steady eyes, no nervousness, a simple kind of charm, and I agreed. He introduced himself as Chris Walker. He said he worked in logistics for a friend's company, had recently moved to L. after a bad divorce, and was trying to start over. It was a simple, honest story, exactly the kind of stability I hadn't seen in years. We talked for an hour at a small cafe down the street. Chris asked about my work, my life, and he actually listened, not with idle curiosity, but with a sincerity that was incredibly disarming. With Chris, for the first time since Jason walked back into my life, the air felt lighter. I laughed. A real, honest-to-God laugh. When he walked me back to my car, the tension was back, but it was different now, mixed with a sudden, fragile hope. "I don't want to intrude," he said, "but I'd really like to see you again. If you'd let me." My heart hammered. He wasn't pushy, he was just respectful. The thought of retreating back into my cold, paranoid apartment, alone with the case, felt unbearable. Against every fiber of caution, I gave him my number. "I'd like that," I whispered. He smiled again, and that was it. Just a nod, a respectful goodbye, and he walked off. But as I drove home, the briefcase in my closet was suddenly heavier. The relief I felt from meeting Chris immediately turned into a suffocating, terrible irony. I had just invited a new person into my existence, a good man who seemed too perfect, while I was sitting on a mountain of illegal cash that could get both of us killed. My life had become a lie the moment Jason handed me that case, and now, my first genuine connection in years was built on top of that lie. I couldn't tell him. How could I say, the man who left me is dead because of the millions I'm hiding in my wardrobe, and now I'm terrified. I spent the next few days in a haze. Chris was attentive, calling and texting, arranging simple, easy dates. Every time he made me laugh, every time he showed some small, genuine kindness, like showing up at my office with my favorite coffee, the walls I had built started to crumble. I was falling for him, and that made the secret exponentially worse. The fear was no longer just for myself, it was for him. He was becoming the thing I had to protect from the darkness Jason had left behind. The clock was ticking. I knew I couldn't keep Chris and the case both hidden forever. The tension of holding the two opposing forces in my life was making me sick. I started thinking about the case, not as money, but as a test. How long could I pretend to be normal before my deadly secret broke through the surface? The weeks that followed my first meeting with Chris were a blur of dangerous hope. He became the quiet center of my life, the perfect contrast to the toxic mess Jason had left behind. Everything about him was steady, the way he called exactly when he said he would, the small things he remembered about my routine, the easy, undemanding way he fit into my small West Hollywood world. For the first time since Jason's spectacular betrayal, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety I lived with actually dimmed. I started sleeping through the night. The briefcase, still buried deep in the back of my closet, became a dark anchor I could almost ignore, as long as Chris was in the room. This was the ultimate betrayal of my own common sense, but I couldn't stop it. Our relationship developed quickly, too fast for a woman who swore off trusting men, but the 1-month clock was ticking for my sanity, too. We spent almost every evening together. We cooked dinner in my apartment, clumsy meals that always ended in laughter, and we spent rainy afternoons curled up on the couch, sharing stories. With Chris, I felt seen, not judged, and that level of comfort was incredibly addictive. The fear that had defined my life for the past 2 weeks finally started to feel like a distant echo. The irony was suffocating. I was building a relationship on the biggest, deadliest secret imaginable, yet it felt more real than anything I'd ever shared with Jason. It was a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks after our first meeting, when the world tilted entirely. I came home from the studio late, exhausted, but Chris was already there. He had cooked a decent pasta dish, but his movements were a little stiff, his smile a little too wide. I noticed the tension immediately. We ate, talking about the usual, my deadlines, his work in logistics, but the air felt thick, waiting for something. When I started to clear the plates, he reached across the table and stopped me. "Wait," he said softly, and his voice was low, absolutely serious. That was when I saw the small, dark velvet box in his hand. My breath hitched. I hadn't expected this. Not so fast, not so perfectly. My heart hammered against my ribs, a painful, frantic beat. He slid out of his chair and dropped onto one knee. His eyes were steady, the sincerity in them a physical force that melted away every layer of my armor. "Olivia Reed," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "You've changed my life in ways I didn't know were possible. I don't want another day to pass without knowing you're mine. Will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, the whole world dissolved. The briefcase, Jason, the Russian money, the fear, it all vanished. All that mattered was the man kneeling in front of me, offering me a life I thought I'd lost forever. The tears started before I could stop them. They weren't tears of grief or fear, they were pure, overwhelming relief. "Yes," I whispered, the word trembling on my lips, then louder, firmer, "Yes, Chris, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto my finger, a modest, beautiful diamond, and I collapsed into his arms. It was the highest emotional point of my life, a moment of unadulterated, blinding happiness. But later that night, after Chris had left, and the apartment was quiet again, the emotional high crashed into a cold, hard wall of reality. The diamond on my hand felt heavy, a mockery of the secret I held. I stood in the living room, my gaze fixed on the closet door. How could I accept this promise, this future, while hiding a truth that could destroy both of us? I had to tell him. Tomorrow. I clung to that decision, letting the warmth of his love carry me through the night. The next afternoon, Chris came over unannounced during my lunch break. He said he couldn't wait until the evening to see me. He was rushing, stressed about a shipment mix-up at work, and apologized that he could only stay 10 minutes. I loved his honesty and his chaos. He set his coat down on the back of a chair and went into the kitchen to grab a bottle of water. I walked over to pick up his coat, planning to hang it up properly, and that's when I felt it, something hard and metallic heavy in the inner pocket. It was pure, conditioned paranoia that made me slip my hand inside. I told myself it was just his keys. But what I pulled out was not a regular set of keys. It was a single, small, highly specific tool, a specialized key used to open commercial security lockboxes, the kind of professional lockpicking tool that only someone in a highly sensitive security or logistics role would carry, or someone who breaks into things. My breath stopped in my throat. I stood there, staring at the perfectly smooth, black piece of metal in my palm. Chris was just 2 feet away, pouring water in the kitchen, oblivious. A highly sensitive logistics role. The words he used to describe his job suddenly sounded chillingly vague, a perfect cover. My mind flashed back to the way he moved when he caught the mugger, the ease, the efficiency. He wasn't out of breath. It was too fast, too clean. I remembered the way he had just appeared that night, exactly when I was at my most vulnerable and paranoid, after the meeting with Mark. The coincidence felt less like fate and more like a setup. He walked back into the living room, completely relaxed. Sorry about the rush, Liv, I'll be back tonight. Kiss me goodbye. I managed to smile, slipping the tool back into his pocket without his noticing, my hand brushing against the warm fabric. My lips felt numb as I kissed him. I can't wait, I lied. The second the door closed behind him, the terrifying certainty hit me. It wasn't about the tool itself, or the mugging, or the vague job. It was the whole pattern. Jason had been a hunter, and now I was dealing with one too. Chris wasn't just a man who loved me. He was too perfect, too smooth, too conveniently placed. He was connected. He was looking for the case. He was the cleaner Mark had warned me about, and the engagement ring on my finger was the bait. I walked straight to the closet, shoved the coats aside, and pulled the briefcase out, setting it on the floor. It was no longer a heavy burden, it was a weapon. The question wasn't if he knew about it, but how he would try to get it. My greatest love had just proposed to me, and he was the most dangerous person I had ever met. The emotional high of the proposal was instantly replaced by a stark, absolute necessity for survival. I had to move, and I had to move fast. But what was the move? Was I supposed to flee, or confront him with the case, and risk him admitting everything, or worse, making me disappear just like Jason? I was now facing the moment of truth, and I didn't know which outcome was more terrifying. The world didn't tilt again, it simply stopped moving. The moment Chris's car pulled away, the blinding love I felt was severed by the cold, precise logic of survival. The professional lockpicking tool, now back in his jacket pocket, wasn't just proof, it was the final, devastating piece of the pattern. He wasn't a hero, a logistics guy, or even just a good man trying to start over. He was a cleaner. He was sent to retrieve the radioactive material Jason had dumped in my life, and I was the safest, most convenient route to it. The engagement ring on my finger suddenly felt like a heavy, cold shackle, not a promise. It had to have been part of the plan, a way to gain proximity, trust, and finally, access to my apartment without breaking down the door. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. Jason betrayed me for ambition, but Chris had used the very thing Jason destroyed, my hope, to do the same. I didn't panic. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. The paranoia that Jason had instilled in me now became my sharpest weapon. I didn't flee, because flight would confirm my guilt and lead them straight to me. I had to face him, and I had to do it on my own terms, before he made his move. The timeline was now minutes, not days. I knew he'd be back that evening, and he would not leave without the case. I took the briefcase out of the closet and put it right where he had placed it that first night, near the front door. Then, I went into the kitchen. I didn't grab a knife, that was a movie trope and useless against a professional. Instead, I stood by the door with an ordinary, heavy, glass vase I usually kept flowers in. It was a crude deterrent, but the real weapon was the truth I planned to expose. He returned just before sunset, exactly when he said he would. He looked genuinely relieved to see me, the stress from his invented shipment mix-up gone. "Sorry, Liv, it was a crazy day," he said, moving to kiss me. I held up my hand, stopping him cold. I walked to the door, stood next to the briefcase, and folded my arms. "It wasn't a crazy day, Chris. It was a successful day. You got the ring on my finger, and now you have the easiest access to the briefcase." The air in the apartment turned instantly arctic. The easy smile slid off his face, replaced by an expression I hadn't seen before, cold, focused, and completely professional. The change was terrifying, but the confirmation gave me strength. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice level, practiced. I didn't raise my voice. The monotone was more effective. "It's the black briefcase, Chris. The one Jason Hayes left here. The one filled with Russian cash he stole from the people who don't send lawyers. The one you came here to find. And you found it, didn't you? All you have to do is take it and go. The job is complete." He looked at me for a long, silent moment. The man I loved was gone. In his place was a stranger, an agent. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try to lie. "You weren't supposed to know," he finally admitted, his voice low, a trace of something that sounded almost like regret breaking through. "When I first met you, it was a job. I owe some people a lot of money, dangerous people. They told me to track down Jason's trail, and it led straight to you. The mugging? Staged. The coffee? Part of the approach." My throat constricted, but I kept the anger steady. "And the proposal? Was that logistics too? Just a clever way to keep the case nearby?" He took a step toward me, desperation warring with control. "No. That wasn't the plan. I swear to you, Olivia, when I saw you, when I started spending time with you, that was real. The mission was to get the case. The ring was about keeping you safe. If I returned it quietly, they'd leave you alone. They wouldn't touch you. If I told you, they would have come for both of us. This was the only way to get you out of it alive." He reached out his hand, but I backed away. "You chose the lie, Chris. From the very first moment, you chose the lie." He looked down at the briefcase, then back at me, the conflict finally tearing his facade. "I love you. I never lied about that. But this isn't my game to play. I have to finish this job so they forget your name. If I walk away with nothing, I'm dead, and they'll still come for the case, and they'll go through you to find it." It was the final, devastating dilemma. He was going to sacrifice himself, or so he claimed, to save me from the people he worked for. But could I believe the love in his eyes when everything else had been a performance? Was this his final, masterful manipulation? "Take it," I whispered, the words scraping my throat. "Just take it and go." He nodded, the simple acceptance of my defeat. He didn't rush. He walked over, picked up the briefcase, and the heavy thud of it settling in his hand was the sound of my life ending for the second time. He looked at the ring on my finger, and then his gaze returned to mine. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the sleek lock-picking tool I had seen, and tossed it on the floor. "You deserve the truth," he said. "The only truth that matters is that I couldn't hurt you. I will handle this, and they will leave you alone. You will be safe." He walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the knob. He didn't turn back. He didn't say goodbye. He simply vanished, just like Jason, but this time, he took the bomb with him. The door closed with a soft, final click. I didn't move for a long time. The room was heavy with the silence of absence. Finally, I walked over to the chair where he had left his coat, and I pulled the diamond ring off my finger, dropping it onto the wooden surface of the coffee table. It didn't make a sound. The next day, the sun rose, and my apartment was still whole. I checked the news. Nothing about the case, nothing about Chris, nothing about Jason's money. It was as if the past 3 weeks had been a fever dream, and all that remained were the overturned emotional landscapes inside me. My quiet life was back, but I was not. The paranoia didn't leave, it simply changed form. I eventually went back to work, but I designed with a new kind of coldness, a sharp edge of distrust. I never saw Chris Walker again, and I never heard from him. He kept his word, the dangerous people left me alone. But the philosophical cost of that safety was immense. I often look at the empty space by the door where the case stood. I wonder if the love he professed was his greatest lie, his most effective tool, or if the truth was more complex, that he truly did fall for the target and chose to sacrifice his heart for my life. Did he take the money because he loved me, or did he leave me because his mission was more valuable? I'll never know. All I know is that 2 men came into my life and took pieces of me. Jason took my past happiness, and Chris took my future trust. I was left alone, safe, and rich in nothing but the bitter knowledge that sometimes, the only thing more dangerous than a lie is the simple, devastating truth that you let yourself believe it. I am alive, but I lost the ability to ever see a simple cup of coffee or a kind smile without wondering what dangerous secret is hidden beneath.